What is up, YouTube? Welcome back to another video. My name is Ben, and today we are going to be breaking down Chris Bumstead's full leg day workout. This is a workout I believe that he filmed about a month ago. So let's just jump right into it. We're going to break down every single exercise, make a commentary a little bit on sort of the setup and the execution, all that stuff, and then hopefully provide some useful takeaways for you all in regards to just leg day training in general as a whole. So starting off with hamstring curls, first of all, I'd like to say that I think starting off any leg day with ham curls is a really, really good idea for a lot of people. I think a lot of people who tend to get knee-related issues, specifically with loading the quads a good deal, a lot of those kinds of issues I've seen remedied in the past. Not that that will work for everyone, but generally remedied just by doing leg curls first, and specifically lying leg curls, because they will train the hamstrings in their most fully shortened position, i.e. when the hip is sort of straight or extended, right? Picture just kind of squeezing your butt in this lying down position. Not that I would do that during the exercise, but that's just the position that you're training them in. And then obviously the knee is bending fully. So, if we can sort of freeze frame this, you can see that Chris's hip is relatively extended, i.e. like a standing position, and that his knee gets pretty close to being fully bent, at least for the range that he specifically has on this exercise. And then I know in tandem with this, he's also doing some walking lunges to warm up his knees as well. So it kind of seems like, although this obviously is a primary hamstring exercise and he is going pretty hard at it, he's also trying to warm up his knees, just generally speaking, for the quad work that is likely to upcome this as well, and the glute work in addition. So something I will make a commentary on is just in general, when we're trying to look at lying leg curl machines, we want to generally use machines that start to get easier toward the top. So if when you start to fail, you fail pretty much toward, like maybe that bottom end of the range is super, super easy, and then you get to that top portion of the range and it's really, really difficult. Sometimes there's nothing that you can do about that, but other times there are ways to sort of manipulate the pad so that the pad can actually kind of roll upward on your calf as you do the curl. Otherwise, if you don't really want to work to finagle that to actually make it easier at the top where you're weaker, maybe a useful thing just to make sure that you fail through the full range, kind of like Chris is doing here, where you can see he kind of goes through the full reps toward maybe the top portion of the range, right? And then as he starts to fatigue, he kind of gets those reps out toward that lower end of the range. Now, the other commentary I will make here is that if you do want to make this more exclusively a hamstring exercise as opposed to a hamstring and a calf exercise, maybe just try to lock out the rep a little bit earlier, right? So this is a really good freeze frame to sort of describe what I mean. The bottom, for many of you, again, if you want to make this more of a hamstring exercise proportionately, and then a sort of a hamstring calf balance, because the calf will help bend the knee. That's a normal mechanistic thing. Maybe just kind of stop somewhere around where Chris has stopped here in this particular freeze frame, so that you can kind of keep leverage toward the hamstrings. When you start to move lower in the range, i.e. right about somewhere down there, or where the knee is pretty much fully straightened, the calf, i.e. the gastroc, which does cross the back of the knee, will be the primary muscle, or the muscle that primarily contributes to the knee flexion component of this movement. So what I would say is make sure that if your goal is primarily in hamstrings, you cut the range a little bit short, but if you want a good balance of hamstring and calf, there's nothing wrong with that whatsoever. And many may argue that a little bit of extra calf work, no one got too upset about. But again, you want to make your goals a little bit more specific, that's something that you can do as well. Something that you can add in addition to that is, like, if you wanted to break the movement up into two different exercises, one that more does the top half of the range, or the top 70%, we'll say, just to train the hamstrings again in that more short position. And then you want to do a separate exercise which just trains the bottom portion of the range, i.e. where the calf is most active. You can do that as well. I've done that several times in different programs, as well as the current program that I'm doing now, where I have one day I pretty much just do the hamstrings dominated portion of the range, and then on a separate exercise I do the calf dominated portion of the range, which does happen to look very small, but in terms of the leverage that the calf has really, really good leverage to bend the knee, specifically when the knee is a little bit more extended or a little bit more straight, i.e. in the bottom position of that leg curl. So Chris kind of moves on here to some dumbbell RDLs, and it looks like he's going to be doing these with a fairly strong emphasis on glutes. Now, a great way to kind of easily identify in an RDL whether the execution lends to more of a glute or a hamstring stimulus is really just in the amount of knee bend that you have, because either way you're going to be bending your hip a good amount. But for the most part, what we can do is we can kind of look at the knee angle and not only ask ourselves, okay, is the knee angle changing, i.e. is the knee bending as I go down, or is it staying really, really rigid and straight? The straighter that you keep the knee in general, with a good amount of hip bend, the more hamstring dominant. Like for instance, like a visually, what this could be represented as is like a stiff-legged deadlift, right, where the knees are a little bit straighter, still slightly bent, but much straighter than Chris is demonstrating here. Where toward the bottom end of the range, the knees actually bend a good amount, where more of that tension will then be placed on the glutes. Many people assume that more knee bend equals more quad, which isn't necessarily true in this particular case, although there will be some degree of small quad involvement because the weight is stacked directly on top of the knee and far from the hip. The hip is the thing that's going to be doing the work here and not really the knee. Yeah, so Chris does a really, really good job here as well, is not really locking out toward the top to maintain tension on the glutes. And as you can see, as he starts to lower the weight and come toward the bottom, he is allowing his knees to bend to some degree so that he can, again, make this more of a glute-focused movement as opposed to hamstrings. Now, will there be some degree of involvement of hamstrings? Of course, no doubt. But because the knee is sort of moving at the same time that the hip is moving, again, in sort of an opposite kind of fashion in relation to the hamstring specifically, the hamstrings, as the knee bends and as the hip bends, actually from the perspective of the knee will shorten, but from the perspective of the hip will lengthen. So the total length change is not too significant, we'll say in something like a squat, whereas something like this, like a leg curl or the previous leg curl that we saw, the knee is the only thing that's moving and the hip is not, right? So you sort of have an anchor point at the hip and then you're moving the knee in tandem with that rather than moving both the hip and the knee at the same time, which again, as I mentioned earlier, would produce more of a glute-biased stimulus. So we all sort of intuitively know that like leg curls equals hamstrings, but that's the reason why. And also I'd like to point out that the same thing in regards to the whole calf hamstring dynamic applies exactly in the same way here. Although this will be training the hamstrings in a more proportionately lengthened position as opposed to the lying leg curl, right? In the lying leg curl, we had more of that, like, if you took a lying leg curl and you just stood it up straight, you would be like kind of in a standing position. But here, because you're seated and because the hip is bent, i.e. your leg is raised up in a sitting position, from the perspective of the hip, the hamstring actually is more lengthened as opposed to more shortened. And so at the top of the range of motion, right, we come to the top of the leg curl where the knee is more straight. We notice that the hamstrings can get fully lengthened, i.e. the knee is straight and the hip is bent, right? And vice versa for the fully shortened, which would be something like a lying leg curl, where the knee at the top is fully bent and the hip is fully straightened, right? So sort of opposite positions there, right? Knee bend versus hip bend. That's kind of what controls the dynamic. All right, so moving on to single leg press, which I love as a choice across the board as opposed to bilateral or two-legged leg press for a number of reasons. The main of which is really just the amount of length that you're able to create in the glutes when you do it single leg. When you do it double leg, you're sort of limited in the amount of hip flexion or knee toward face motion that you're able to achieve. And as you can see, Chris is getting a really, really good stretch on that glute and also some degree of stretch on the quads just because the knee is bending. Now, a little bit of a note on the specific machine that he's using. You can see if you really focus on sort of this portion of the movement, right, where the foot is sort of tracking, you can see that the foot is tracking not only back, but also sort of down, and that's just because of the arc of the machine. Now, the more down type motion that you're able to utilize, the more quad bias this movement will be, because just think about like if you were just to extend your knee, push your knee more straight, your foot would kind of go upward, right? So to match that arc, a lot of times the leg presses that are really quad dominant will go up to down, but because Chris has his foot much higher, he's creating a situation where he'll proportionately get much more glute stimulus, right? So if I were to kind of freeze frame this in the bottom, right, the line of force is almost going directly, it's probably a little bit farther forward here, but it's almost going directly through his knee, especially toward that bottom end of the range where the knee is much closer to where the line of force is as opposed to the hip. And just like I mentioned in the RDL, knee versus hip, if the load is farther away from a joint, that joint is going to have more leverage to do work on that load, as opposed to the joints that are directly stacked on top of that load. Now, obviously, up to a certain point, if shit gets really heavy, all joints are going to be contributing as much as they possibly can, but the relationship between how much each joint will contribute will change depending on where that load is actually going. So when you're looking at a leg press and you're trying to see for yourself, like, hey, is this quad dominant versus glute dominant? All you have to really look at from the side is basically just draw a line from where your foot is straight through, your hip and your shin, or your femur and your shin, right, your leg and your shin, and then see, okay, the line relative to the knee and relative to the hip, which one is, which joint is farther away. And again, for instance, even though that, as I mentioned earlier, that arc of the machine is still going down and not directly back or up, he is going to get a really, really good amount of glute here, again, despite that. If you really wanted to visualize a really good glute dominant leg press, first thing that comes to mind is something like the Atlantis pendulum press, where the arc of motion is actually sort of scoops up toward you, as opposed to moving down toward you, right? So moving down toward you would sort of be more quad focus, even though he has his foot set up pretty high, like I mentioned earlier, and then scooping up toward you would be much more of a glute focus, just because of all the variables that play into sort of what creates recruitment. All right, so moving on to the hip abduction machine. Now, a lot of people falsely assume that this is going to be a ton of glute max stimulus, just because they sort of feel things on the back of their butt. But this will primarily, at least in my estimation, be an exercise that will train the other glutes, the more lateral glutes, i.e. the glute med and the glute min. And then in addition, some of those more deep hip rotators, which become abductors, i.e. muscles that pull the leg outward when the hip is in this kind of more flexed or bent position up in the seat. So really, really good exercise, I think, for training those lateral glutes and for training, like I said, those smaller deep hip rotators like the piriformis, for example. Not an exercise that I would choose to train my glute max. But because Chris has already had two really, really solid movements to do that, i.e. the RDL with the slightly bent knee, as well as the leg press, he's good to go on a glute max stimulus there. And then so moving on to seated calves, which will train the gastroc specifically, right, the one that crosses the knee in a more shortened position because the knee is bent, and as well as the soleus, obviously, which is the muscle underneath of the gastroc, a really, really high amount. So generally speaking, people have viewed seated calf versus straight knee calf as like more versus less soleus, and that is kind of true. But the reason that it's true is because of the length change in the gastroc, or the outer calf, again, that crosses the knee. When it's shorter, it has less of an ability to contribute to force production, just because muscles, as they shorten, tend to get weaker. So Chris also, in tandem with the seated calves, is, I believe, doing like a standing leg curl type thing. In addition, it looks like this more donkey-style calf raise, which, by the way, I don't love the donkey-style calf raise, just because it seems like it's unnecessarily creating this sort of compression shear force on your spine that doesn't really make too much sense to me. I would rather just get in a standing calf machine with the pads on my shoulders, or hell, even just do some single leg calf raise with my knee straight. Then Chris also kind of briefly mentions that he just wanted to get some extra back work in, so he's throwing in some pull-ups. Pull-ups, kind of a discussion for maybe a different video altogether, but not a huge fan of pull-ups for a number of reasons. I think pull-downs with cables and with more specific loading directions and freedom of motion through the hands can be a little bit more effective for a majority of people, and also just more comfortable for a majority of people. But again, like I said, kind of a topic for another time. All right, so that was pretty much it for Chris's leg day. He did a whole lot of glutes, whole lot of hamstrings, whole lot of calves, with a sprinkle of quads sort of interspersed. So I have a feeling that this was more predominantly like a glute ham day for him. Maybe another time I'll cover a more quad dominant day if that's something that you all want to see. But as always, please like, please share if you enjoy this video. And in the comment section below, let me know whose other videos you would like me to review and cover from this same sort of a standpoint. Really enjoy doing these, so thanks all for watching, and I will see you in the next one.